There's a fantasy that every human being has entertained at least once in their life. You imagine that you are walking in your backyard or perhaps hiking in a remote forest and you stumble upon something. You dig into the earth and your shovel hits something hard. You clear away the dirt and you realize it is not a rock. It is a vein of pure solid gold, or perhaps silver. You realize in that moment that you are rich. You will never have to work again. You will never have to worry about bills. You can buy the biggest house. You can buy the fastest car. You can eat the finest food. We believe this because we are taught that money is the solution to all problems. We believe that wealth is a physical thing that you can find and possess, but history tells us a different story. History tells us that finding a mountain of money can be the most dangerous thing that ever happens to a person or to a nation. This is the story of the time it actually happened. This is the story of the Spanish Empire in the 16th century. They did not just find a pot of gold, they found an entire mountain of silver. They found more wealth than had ever existed in the history of the world. They thought it was a blessing from God. They thought it would make them the masters of the earth forever. But instead, it destroyed them. It destroyed their economy. It destroyed their work ethic. It destroyed their government. And it turned the richest nation in Europe into a bankrupt backwater. Before we dive in, a quick but important update. YouTube has shut down monetization for this channel. We are keeping the lights on. That's why we have launched on Rumble, Facebook, Spotify, and Patreon. If you enjoy this content, please pause right now and follow us on those platforms using the links in the pinned comment. We may eventually stop posting here entirely, so make the move with us today. Now, let's get back to the video. This is the story of the silver curse, and it is the ultimate lesson in the difference between money and wealth. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to a time when Spain was hungry. In the year 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We all know the rhyme, but we often forget why he sailed. He was not looking for land. He was looking for a trade route. He was looking for access to the spices and silks of Asia. Europe in the 15th century was not a rich place. It was recovering from the Black Death. It was cold. It was constantly at war. Gold and silver were rare. Money was hard money. It was coins made of precious metal. If you didn't have the metal, you couldn't buy anything. When Columbus returned from the Americas, he brought back a few gold trinkets. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start a fever. For the next 50 years, Spanish adventurers known as conquistadors swarmed across the Atlantic Ocean. Men like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, they were ruthless men. They were looking for El Dorado, the city of gold. They toppled the Aztec Empire in Mexico. They toppled the Inca Empire in Peru. They stole the gold artworks of these civilizations and melted them down into bars. This initial loot made Spain rich, but loot is a one-time event. Once you melt down the statues, they are gone. Spain needed a steady source of income. They needed a mine. And in the year 1545, they found it. The story goes that a local indigenous man named Diego Gualpa was searching for a lost llama in the high Andes Mountains of what is now Bolivia. The location was desolate. It was over 4,000 meters above sea level. The air was thin. It was freezing cold. Diego slipped on a rocky slope. To stop his fall, he grabbed a bush. The bush came out by the roots. And there in the hole where the roots had been, he saw a glint. He looked closer. It was a vein of silver ore, and it was incredibly pure. He had stumbled upon the Cerro Rico, the rich mountain. It was a geological freak of nature, a volcanic cone that was practically made of silver. It was the largest deposit of silver ever found on planet Earth. News traveled fast. Within months, thousands of Spaniards rushed to the desolate mountain. They founded a city at the foot of the mountain. They called it Potosi. Potosi became the wildest city in the world. Within a few decades, it had a population larger than London or Paris. It was a city of gambling dens and churches and brothels and violence. It was the Wild West 300 years before the American Wild West. But the most important thing about Potosi was what was coming out of the ground. Every year, thousands of tons of silver ore were dug out of the mountain. At first, it was easy. The silver was right on the surface. But soon, they had to dig deeper. They built a massive industrial complex. They used a new technology called the mercury amalgamation process. They mixed the crushed ore with mercury to extract the silver. It was a toxic and deadly process, but it was efficient. The silver was melted into bars, then it was minted into coins, the famous Spanish dollar, the piece of 8. These coins were loaded onto mules. Long trains of mules carried the silver down from the high Andes to the coast to the Pacific. Then it was shipped to Panama. Then it was carried across the jungle to the Atlantic, and there the great treasure fleet waited. Twice a year, a massive convoy of Spanish galleons, heavily armed with cannons, would set sail for Seville. Imagine standing on the docks of Seville in the year 1560 or 1580. You would see the horizon fill with white sails. The bells of the cathedral would ring. The people would run to the harbor. The ships would dock and the unloading would begin. Bar after bar of silver, sack after sack of coins. It was an endless river of money. The king of Spain at this time was Philip II. He was the most powerful man in the world. He ruled Spain. He ruled Portugal. He ruled the Netherlands. He ruled huge parts of Italy. He ruled the Americas. And he ruled the Philippines and Asia. They said the sun never set on his empire. And now he had unlimited money. Philip looked at the silver arriving in Seville, and he believed that God was on his side. He believed that this wealth was given to him to unite Europe under the Catholic faith. So he started to spend. He built the Escorial, a massive palace and monastery outside Madrid. He built a new capital city, but mostly he spent the money on war. War is the most expensive thing a nation can do. And Philip was fighting everyone at once. He was fighting the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. He built a massive fleet of galleys to fight the Battle of Lepanto. He was fighting the Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. This was a war that lasted for 80 years. It was a black hole for money. Tens of thousands of Spanish soldiers had to be paid and fed and armed. He was fighting the French. And eventually, he decided to fight the English. He built the Spanish Armada, the greatest invasion fleet in history, 130 ships, 30,000 men, all paid for with the silver from Potosi. From the outside, Spain looked invincible. It had the best army, it had the biggest navy, it had the most money, but underneath the surface, something strange was happening, something that the economists of the time could not understand. The people of Spain were getting poorer. This didn't make sense. The country was awash in silver. There were more coins in circulation than ever before. Wages were going up. A carpenter in Castile was earning 3 times as much as he had 50 years earlier, but the price of bread had gone up 4 times. The price of cloth had gone up 5 times. The cost of living was exploding. This was a new phenomenon. For the previous 1,000 years, prices in Europe had been mostly stable. A loaf of bread cost a penny in the year 1200, and it cost a penny in the year 1400. But suddenly, prices were skyrocketing. They called it the price revolution. The Spanish government didn't understand it. They blamed the merchants. They said the merchants were greedy. They passed laws trying to fix the prices of goods. But the laws didn't work. The problem was simple supply and demand. But it wasn't the supply of goods that was changing. It was the supply of money. Spain had flooded its own economy with silver, but it hadn't increased the amount of bread or shoes or houses. If you double the amount of money in a country, but you have the same number of houses, the price of a house will double. That is inflation. And this inflation began to eat away at the soul of the Spanish economy. Here is the tragedy of the curse. Because prices were so high in Spain, everything made in Spain became expensive. Spanish wool was the best in the world, but now it was too expensive to buy. Spanish steel was legendary, but now it was too expensive to export. Meanwhile, in other countries like France and England and the Netherlands, they didn't have mountains of silver. Their prices remained lower. So what did the Spanish people do? They did what any consumer does. They bought the cheaper goods. A Spanish nobleman who wanted a new velvet cloak didn't buy it from a Spanish tailor. He bought it from a Dutch merchant because it was half the price. A Spanish farmer who needed a new plow didn't buy it from the local blacksmith. He bought a French plow. So the silver didn't stay in Spain. It flowed right through Spain. It came in on the ships at Seville and it went out in the pockets of foreign merchants. Spain became a funnel. They did all the hard work of mining the silver. They enslaved the indigenous people. They risked the ocean crossings. They transported the heavy metal. And then they handed it over to their enemies in exchange for consumer goods. There is a famous quote from the time. A Spanish economist wrote that Spain is like a mouth that receives the food, warms it, and then sends it to the stomach, which is the rest of Europe. Spain was doing the chewing, but the rest of Europe was getting the nutrition. This destroyed Spanish industry. Why would you build a factory in Spain if your costs were high and you couldn't compete with foreign imports? So the factories closed, the looms stopped weaving, the foundries went cold, the Spanish people stopped producing. A culture of leisure began to take hold. The idea of working with your hands became looked down upon. If you had silver in your pocket, why should you work? The rich bought titles, they bought land, they became idle aristocrats. The poor flocked to the cities to beg or to join the church or to join the army. The middle class, the productive class that makes a nation strong, began to vanish. And meanwhile, the king was spending money he didn't have. This is the most shocking part of the story. You would think that a king with a mountain of silver would be debt-free. But Philip II was spending the silver before it even arrived. He was borrowing money from German and Italian bankers, the Fuggers and the Welsers. He would take out a massive loan to pay for a new army. And as collateral, he would pledge the next year's shipment of silver from the treasure fleet. He was living paycheck to paycheck, but on a continental scale. He was betting that the silver would keep coming forever. He was betting that the ships wouldn't sink in a hurricane. He was betting that pirates wouldn't steal the cargo. But sometimes the ships did sink, and sometimes the silver wasn't enough to cover the interest on the loans. The debt grew and grew. It became a mountain of debt to match the mountain of silver. By the year 1557, the situation was critical. The wars in France and the Netherlands were costing millions of ducats a month. The ships from the Americas were delayed. The bankers in Genoa were demanding payment. Philip II, the master of the universe, had to do the unthinkable. On New Year's Day, 1557, he declared national bankruptcy. He suspended payments to the bankers. He told them that he couldn't pay. It sent a shockwave through the financial world. Banks in Europe collapsed. Soldiers in the Spanish army stopped getting paid. When soldiers don't get paid, they don't fight. Or worse, they mutiny. The Spanish Fury happened in the Netherlands. Unpaid Spanish troops rampaged through the city of Antwerp, burning and looting because the king had no silver for them. You would think this would be a wake-up call. You would think the king would cut spending, stop the wars, focus on rebuilding the economy. But he didn't. He couldn't. He was addicted to the silver. As soon as the next treasure fleet arrived, he paid off a little bit of the debt, promised the bankers more interest, and started borrowing again. It was a Ponzi scheme. Spain went bankrupt again in 1575, and again in 1596. 3 times in the reign of one king, the richest nation on earth defaulted on its debts. It is a lesson that rings true today. It doesn't matter how much income you have. If you spend more than you make, you will go broke. But the curse went deeper than just debt. It changed the political structure of the country. Because the king had his own source of income from the mines, he didn't need to ask his people for taxes. In other countries like England, the king had to go to Parliament to ask for money. This meant the king had to listen to the people. He had to make deals. This led to democracy. But in Spain, the king didn't need the Parliament. He didn't need the merchants. He had Potosi. So the government became autocratic. It became centralized. It became inefficient. The king tried to micromanage everything from his desk in the Escorial. But he was drowning in paperwork. And while the government was paralyzed, the economy was hollowing out. Let's look at the fate of the silver itself. Where did it go? We said it flowed out of Spain to France and Holland. But it didn't stay there either. The Europeans used the silver to trade with the one place that actually wanted it, China. The Ming Dynasty in China had a huge appetite for silver. Their economy was booming, but they had no silver mines of their own. They used silver for their currency and their tax system. So the Spanish silver traveled a full circle around the globe. It was mined in Bolivia, shipped to Spain, spent in Holland to buy cloth. The Dutch took it to Asia to buy spices and porcelain, and it ended up in the treasury of the Chinese emperor. For a while, this global trade made everyone feel rich. But back in Potosi, the mountain was getting tired. By the early 1600s, the easy silver was gone. The miners had to dig deeper and deeper. The shafts were hot and dangerous. The cost of extraction went up. The indigenous population was dying from the brutal conditions. The Mita system, which was a form of forced labor, dragged thousands of men into the mines every year, and many never came back. This was the human cost of the inflation. As the mines became harder to work, the flow of treasure began to slow down. And this is when the real crisis hit. Spain had built an entire society based on the assumption of free money. They had an army they couldn't afford, a bureaucracy they couldn't afford, and a lifestyle they couldn't afford. When the silver tap was turned down, the withdrawal symptoms were brutal. The 17th century was a nightmare for Spain. They lost the war in the Netherlands. They lost the war with England. They lost their dominance in Europe. The population of Spain actually fell. People left the country. They emigrated to the Americas, or they died of hunger and disease. Villages were abandoned. The fields went fallow. The once mighty galleons sat rotting in the harbors. The empire that had owned the world became the sick man of Europe, and other nations looked at Spain and they learned a lesson, or at least they tried to. They learned that digging gold out of the ground is not the same as creating wealth. Wealth is a farm that produces wheat. Wealth is a loom that produces cloth. Wealth is a shipyard that builds boats. Wealth is the capacity to produce things that people want. Money is just a way of keeping score. If you have all the points on the scoreboard but you don't have any players on the field, you will lose the game. Spain forgot the players. They focused only on the score. But the story of the silver curse is not just ancient history. It is a warning for the modern world. We see the same pattern today in countries that discover oil. Economists call it the Dutch disease. When a country finds oil, their currency goes up, their exports become expensive, their other industries die, and the government becomes bloated and corrupt because they live off the oil money instead of taxes. Look at Venezuela. It has the largest oil reserves in the world. It should be the richest country in South America, but it is one of the poorest. Why? Because, like Spain, they neglected their agriculture and their industry. They imported everything. And when the oil price crashed, they had nothing left. Look at Nauru, the tiny island that found phosphate. They became the richest people per capita in the world for a decade. Now they're broke. But there is an even bigger warning in the Spanish story. A warning for the United States and the Western world today. Spain thought they could print prosperity. They didn't print paper, but they minted coins that cost them very little to acquire. Today, we do print paper. We have central banks that can create trillions of dollars with a keystroke. We used this power to fight the financial crisis of 2008. We used it to fight the pandemic of 2020. We flooded the world with money just like the Spanish flooded Europe with silver. And just like in the 16th century, we are seeing the prices rise. We are seeing the cost of housing explode. We are seeing the cost of food go up. We are seeing the manufacturing base hollow out because it is cheaper to buy from overseas. Are we making the same mistake as Philip II? Are we confusing the money in our bank accounts with the actual health of our economy? The Spanish Empire took 100 years to collapse. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, painful slide into irrelevance. It happened so slowly that most people didn't realize it was happening until it was too late. They kept partying in Madrid. They kept building churches. They kept pretending they were the masters of the world. But the foundation had rotted away. The mountain of silver was still there in the distance, a red, majestic peak towering over the Andes. But inside it was hollow, just like the empire that found it. This is the story of the illusion of wealth. But to truly understand the mechanics of the collapse, we need to look closer at the human side. We need to look at the bankers who fueled the addiction. And we need to look at the final desperate attempts to save the ship. When a nation is addicted to easy money, the first people to notice are usually the bankers. In the 16th century, the center of the financial world was not Madrid. It was Genoa in Italy and Augsburg in Germany. The bankers there were men like the Fuggers. They were the masters of capital. They lent money to kings and emperors. They looked at Philip II of Spain and they saw a whale. A giant, profitable, dangerous whale. They knew he was reckless. They knew he was spending more than he earned, but they kept lending him money. Why? Because of the collateral. Every time Philip asked for a loan, he pointed across the ocean. He pointed to the next treasure fleet that was due to arrive from the Americas. He said, "Look at the ships. Look at the silver. It is guaranteed." The bankers calculated the risk. They charged him high interest, sometimes 20%, sometimes 40%. They knew that if the ships arrived, they would make a fortune. But they also knew that if the ships sank, they would lose everything. It was the original high-stakes gambling. But as the debts piled up, the bankers started to get nervous. They realized that Spain was stuck in a trap. To pay off the old loans, Spain had to take out new loans. It is what we call a debt spiral today. And just like in a modern financial crisis, when the music stops, everyone falls down. In 1575, the music stopped. Philip declared bankruptcy for the second time. He suspended payments on the national debt. He effectively told the bankers that their paper was worthless. The result was catastrophe. The Fugger Bank, one of the richest in Europe, was brought to its knees. The Genoese bankers were ruined. But the most immediate impact was on the Spanish army. The Spanish army in the Netherlands was fighting a bitter war against the Dutch rebels. They were the best soldiers in Europe, but they hadn't been paid in months. When the news arrived that the king was bankrupt again, the soldiers snapped. They mutinied. They marched on the city of Antwerp, which was the commercial hub of northern Europe. It was a rich, loyal city. The Spanish troops sacked it. They burned houses. They killed thousands of civilians. They stole everything that wasn't nailed down. It was called the Spanish Fury. It was a public relations disaster for Spain. It turned the people of the Netherlands against them forever. It united the rebels. And it showed the world the ugly truth about the Spanish Empire. It was a giant with feet of clay. It had all the silver in the world, but it couldn't even pay its own soldiers to stop killing its own subjects. This is the paradox of resource wealth. When you have easy money, you don't build institutions. You don't build a tax system that works. You don't build a professional bureaucracy. You rely on the windfall. And when the windfall stops, the chaos begins. But the story gets darker when we look at where the silver actually came from. We have talked about the mines of Potosi as if they were just a hole in the ground, but they were a graveyard. The mining conditions were horrific. The altitude was so high that plants wouldn't grow. The air was thin. The tunnels were deep and hot. The Spanish used a system called the mita. It was a form of forced labor adapted from the Inca Empire. Every year, thousands of indigenous men were drafted from their villages and marched to Potosi. They were forced to work in the mines for weeks at a time without seeing the sun. They carried heavy sacks of ore up rickety ladders. If they fell, they died. If they collapsed from exhaustion, they were beaten. But the real killer was the dust. The dust in the mines caused silicosis, a lung disease that slowly suffocated the miners. They called it the mountain that eats men. And then there was the mercury. To extract the silver from the ore, the Spanish used mercury. They mixed it with their bare feet. The mercury absorbed into their skin. It caused tremors. It caused madness. It caused death. Historians estimate that millions of people died in the mines of Potosi and the mercury mines of Huancavelica over the centuries. This was the true cost of the Spanish inflation. Every silver coin that circulated in Europe, every piece of 8 that bought a loaf of bread in Madrid was stained with blood. It makes you wonder, if the people of Spain had known the true cost, would they have spent the money so freely? Probably. Because human nature rarely looks at the supply chain. We only look at the price tag. By the 17th century, the decline of Spain was undeniable. The king died. Philip II was succeeded by Philip III and then Philip IV. These were not the strong leaders of the past. They were weak men. They left the government in the hands of favorites and corrupt ministers. The economy was in ruins. Spain had become a nation of beggars and aristocrats. The productive middle class had been wiped out by inflation and taxes. The only people who made money were the ones with connections to the government, the people who got the contracts to supply the army, the people who got the licenses to trade with the Americas. It was a crony economy. And then the silver started to run out. It wasn't that the mountain was empty. There was still silver there, but it was harder to get. The ore was lower grade. The costs were higher, and the flow of treasure across the Atlantic began to trickle. The convoys got smaller. The ships arrived less often. Spain tried to squeeze more money out of its other colonies. They raised taxes in Mexico. They raised taxes in Peru. But you cannot tax people into prosperity. The colonies started to become restless. They started to resent Madrid. They saw Spain as a parasite that took their wealth and gave nothing back. This was the seed of the independence movements that would eventually tear the empire apart in the 19th century. But before the end, there was one final humiliation. In 1628, a Dutch admiral named Piet Hein pulled off the greatest heist in naval history. He captured the entire Spanish treasure fleet off the coast of Cuba. He seized tons of silver, gold, pearls, indigo. It was a staggering loss for Spain. It was the first time the entire fleet had been lost to enemy action. When the news reached Madrid, the economy collapsed again. The king couldn't pay his debts. The bankers fled. But in Amsterdam, there was a party. The Dutch used the stolen silver to fund their own army. They used it to fight the Spanish. It was the ultimate irony. The silver that Spain had mined was used to pay the soldiers who defeated Spain. So, what is the lesson here? Why does this story matter today? Because we are living in a world that looks suspiciously like 16th century Spain. We have a global economy that is built on debt. We have governments that run massive deficits. They spend money they don't have on wars they can't win and social programs they can't afford. We have a financial system that relies on the constant injection of new money from central banks. We call it quantitative easing. The Spanish called it the treasure fleet. The mechanism is different, but the result is the same. Asset bubbles, inflation, the erosion of the middle class. When money is cheap, people stop valuing work. They start valuing speculation. In Spain, everyone wanted to be a hidalgo, a nobleman who lived off his rents. Today, everyone wants to be a crypto millionaire or a day trader. We have lost respect for the slow, boring process of making things. We have forgotten that wealth is not a number on a screen. Wealth is a factory. Wealth is a farm. Wealth is an educated population. Spain had the number. They had the biggest number in the world. But they let their farms turn to dust. They let their factories close. They let their people become illiterate. And when the number went away, they had nothing left. The Spanish Empire lasted for 300 years. It was a glorious and terrible experiment. It gave us the Spanish language, which is spoken by 500 million people today. It gave us beautiful art and literature. Don Quixote was written during this time of decline, a satire of a world that was losing its mind. But as an economic model, it was a disaster. It proved that you cannot cheat the laws of economics. You cannot consume more than you produce forever. Eventually, the bill comes due. The mountain of Potosi still stands today. It is a red cone rising out of the Bolivian Altiplano. It is scarred with tunnels and sinkholes. Men still go inside it to look for scraps of silver. It is a monument to greed. It is a monument to the folly of believing that easy money can solve hard problems. The next time you hear a politician promise a new spending program without raising taxes. The next time you hear a central banker say that printing money has no consequences. Think of Philip II. Think of the king who owned the world and died bankrupt. Think of the ships sailing into Seville heavy with treasure and the people starving in the streets. The curse of Potosi is not a myth. It is a mathematical certainty. If you mistake money for wealth, you will end up with neither. And that is a lesson that every empire learns usually right before the end. Thanks for watching.